Hello, class, and welcome to Chapter 13 on Power, Influence, and Politics. First of all, I hope some of you have already aced your exam and are got the semester over with, and apologize for my late post here on Wednesday. I know many of you want to get your replies out there, so hopefully this will help with that. Four things I want to talk about: types of power and uses, influence in organizations as well as upward influence, recognizing common political tactics and causes, and then impression management. Politics is about conflict, and conflict is something we're all going to face if you haven't already in the organizations that you work in. We live in a fallen world. Because we live in a fallen world, we're going to have to deal with power, influence, and politics. If you'll turn or move to the next slide, you'll see a couple of verses there just to provide a biblical context for the world that we operate in. And you can read those on your own. I'm not going to read those out loud, but it's clear that because of the fallen condition of this earth, we have to recognize we're going to have to deal with politics from time to time. Next slide. Question. This is what I want you to keep in your mind as you hear what we talk about, and also toward the end, and this is the question to answer. In your profession or social interactions, up to this point in your life, would you characterize yourself as having been a victim or a beneficiary of organizational politics, and why? Specifically, next slide, I want to look at power, influence, and politics. Proper use can be a tool for managerial success. Improper use can undermine trust, create unethical behavior, and create a real toxic environment. Next slide. Power in organizations. Conflict often is about power and influence and the way power is manifested in the organizations across work groups. There's position power and personal power. The text talked about legitimate, reward, and coercive aspects of position power. I know if you look at that list and you read the descriptions, if you're like me, you're going to gravitate to probably legitimate or reward types of power, and we all are going to repel organizations where coercive type of power is used. It's not helpful. It's not stimulating. It's certainly not a safe place. Personal power, on the other hand, is where you have people who lead that are experts, or they have informational understanding or institutional knowledge perhaps, or referent, where there's a sense of charisma and attractiveness and appeal in how they interact with the organization. And then persuasive, command of the facts and logic. You know, facts speak highly, but sometimes just because the facts exist doesn't mean that an organization necessarily goes along with it. The use of power, if you'll look at the next slide, slide number 6, you can see the number in the right-hand corner. There's 4 types of power our text looks at and use of it. There's the acquisition of power, the abuse of power, empowerment, and subunit power. I'm not going to go into each of these, but I do want to call out a couple. Abuse of power. You see the picture there of Harvey Weinstein, who has clearly set up and created a narrative, a national narrative that has made a lot of organizations and companies take stock. And we're seeing it constantly all over the place. CEOs stepping down, different organizations kicking, boards of directors, taking CEOs off the payroll and such. But I want to focus on the positive, empowerment. And one of the things I love is that in 2015, there was a movie that came out called Spare Parts. It's a story of Carl Hayden High School, a teacher who was a substitute at that, along with 4 or 5 students from that school, a high school, entered a submersible remote control device, and they ultimately won in a national contest, beating out MIT and such. This teacher employed empowerment in enlisting these young men, and these young men actually did all the work. Subunit power is the idea that certain departments or work groups within an organization have the power. Resource scarcity comes down to supply and demand. If there's great supply, chances are they're not going to have much power. But if there is demand, if there's the demand for the resource, they're going to have power. Centrality is the idea that, say, procurement or internal auditing, they are sort of the center of the universe. They can actually control what happens in the rest of the organization and dictate the power sequence, if you will, in that organization. Substitutability and uncertainty. I just want to focus on uncertainty. When people are fearful or anxious about the organization they work in, particularly in a work group, that can be a unique set of ways to influence the organization. So if a department can create a sense of uncertainty for folks, that will give them some power. Next slide. Influence tactics. I'm not going to address all of these, but I do want to call out a couple. Influence tactics of coalition building. Coalition building, to me, is the most effective kind of influence inside an organization because it requires you to interact with other people and to convince them to come along with whatever it is you're trying to promote inside the organization. It also creates relationships, and it forces you, the person who's trying to influence, if you're the leader, to get more people on board. And if you have more people on board, that's a better type of persuasion and influence than just trying to do some of these other things, which is applying pressure or having to resort to your own personal appeals and that kind of thing. Responses to influence tactics: commitment, compliance, passive resistance, and active resistance. Active resistors to influence tactics are going to be verbal. They're going to be out loud. They're not going to hold anything back. It may be ideological appeals that are made to fight back on a particular thing that a leader is desiring to do. Commitment is the idea of endorsing and becoming an advocate for whatever it is that needs to be introduced into the organization. Compliance is go along, get along. You have people like that in every organization. They want to keep the nickel shiny, and there's nothing wrong with that. It takes all of us. Some of us are different parts of the body that's the organization, the body of Christ, if you will. Passive resistance are those that say, I'm not going to support that, but I'm going to look like I support it. And that's a hard thing to stomach sometimes for a leader or a manager. The next slide, slide 8, upward influence tactics. Think of this as how you're going to talk to your boss or how you're going to talk to the person who has authority over you in your organization. Is what's the best way to relate to them and influence them. And there's a lot of ways to go about that, but it also requires skills of perception on your part and sort of something of an emotional intelligence and social aptitude to recognize what kind of leader is going to respond best to some of these. I doubt there are many leaders that we have worked for that necessarily want to see someone be aggressive all the time. There might be some, but these sort of mirror some of the tactics that we just talked about and are pretty straightforward. You know, you can ingratiate Dr. Kirk all you want, but if you don't get your assignment done, you're not going to get the grade you want. Organizational politics. There are a variety of political tactics in organizations. Again, I'm not going to address every single one of these. You can see them in the slide for yourself. But controlling information, controlling lines of communication, controlling the agenda, all of these are about exerting control over the organization in order to get your way. Control, in certain circumstances, might be beneficial, but on the whole, those kinds of political tactics might not be desirable. Just a little sidebar here. If you have ever blind copied someone and the person you're sending the email to doesn't know that, you might be an organizational politician. I'm just saying. The next slide, organizational politics continued and some of the tactics. Image building, enlisting spin doctors. That I would not recommend. I'm in this business and I hate to be referred to as that. That is not what ultimately image is about. Image is finding what you are actually, and then the aspects of that make sense, that become your brand, then become what you promote. You don't create something out of nothing. Building coalitions, we've already talked about the significance of that. That's a good political tactic. And controlling decision parameters. This is where you influence the decisions before they're made. So you do a little bit of internal lobbying. And I know some of you may have experienced that. Causes of political behavior on the next slide. Uncertainty, scarce resources, a desire to avoid conflict, and organizational policies. These are all things that cause political behavior to exist. Pretty straightforward in our text, and you can see the description of those right there. I'll just point out that uncertainty, a lack of specific rules, creates a vacuum and can be very, very hard for people to address. It just, people don't want to work in that kind of environment. And people who want to avoid conflict. If they want to avoid conflict, they'll do end runs and walk-arounds and drop grenades over the wall. Those kinds of things are not desirable. Finally, impression management. Last slide, or slide 12. This is you see the quote up there. That's a lift from a lyric by Carole King. Basically, a person who is so caught up in who they are, they want people to desire them by virtue of their image and how people perceive them. And got to be careful about this. Again, this gets back to an emotional IQ and a social intelligence, I think, that can help you see through some of those kinds of things. I don't recommend that you go out and hire a stylist or someone necessary to create a version of you that's not you. Be who you are and impress people with your skills and your assets on their own. So what's the question again? In your profession or social interactions up to this point in your life, would you characterize yourself as having been mostly a victim or a beneficiary of organizational politics, and why? I look forward to reading those of you who may respond to the question. I've enjoyed our class and reading all of your video posts and your posts in the discussion forum. Have a great day. Thank you.